I am starting now.
Well, I guess we should start, right?
We should start. Let's start.
Well, I have a question about your show and some of your work that you're doing. I would like to start out asking about sort of the emotional content that you're working with. I know we talked earlier and also talked about this in your studio about how some people see an aggressive approach, other people see a more sort of art historical connection to the abstract artists of the past. What are you putting into this work in your own emotions? What's going on here?
I mean, I am doing both those things. But yeah, I mean, one thing that I don't talk about it, I'd like to talk about a little more would be like they are very emotional. They're made in a really physical, aggressive way. It's a place for me to dump a lot of my neurosis and anxiety, you know? And so what you and I were talking about previously, these are not necessarily quiet these aren't necessarily quiet or meditative paintings, although I have a big admiration for work that's like that. They're all really physical, they're kind of loud, they're aggressive, and that's all part of me, you know? This gives me a place to put that without, going out and making a lot of bad decisions or punching someone in the face, right? So, but at the same time, the tightrope to walk is to do those sorts of more impulsive emotional things in a way that also ties in formal resolution and nods at sort of historical references, art historical references that I'm interested in.
Well, I was also seeing when you talked about comedy and how that sort of relates, and a comedian will punch you with something hard, but also make you feel kind of laugh about it.
Tickle it under the arm.
Exactly. So, and a lot of this work does that feeling of it punches you, and then it's also like, well, it's still fun, Yeah, it hits you in the arm a little bit, and then you're just, it's a little punchy.
I want to smack you in the face while making you laugh.
Exactly.
And, I mean, I have this. In a previous life, I was a daily comic strip cartoonist, and I did editorial cartoons. I was a cartoonist, and I was writing jokes. And there was a indirect, playful, humorous reference going on, not just in the way they're made with these sometimes if we can just sort of look over here, where you see these sort of more cartoonish references with scribbling in black lines and things like that. But, sometimes the color palettes are a little bit jovial, lighthearted, and playful too. So that sort of humor and comedy, while it's probably a little less direct, a little more indirect in it, it's always there. I mean, one of my philosophies in life is you can't lose your sense of humor. If you lose your sense of humor, especially at a time like this, now more than ever, you're kind of up the creek without a paddle.
Oh, definitely.
So.
And the work speaks to that with a lot of action to it, and the colors punchy. Tell me something about, though, a lot of yours is figurative. Is that because you were in the comic books and sort of comic referencing, or?
Probably, yeah. I mean, like I was doing a video the other day, and we were talking. I said, it's funny. I'm on the piece on the cover of that book. It's called Texas Abstract Modern Contemporary, and there's certainly quote unquote abstraction going on in the work, or they're kind of abstract paintings, but there's always a sort of cartoonish or figurative reference. Maybe it's not always super cartoonish, but and it comes out of that background. I don't want, after years of doing cartoons and cartoon characters and things, that still threads through the work much more indirectly than it would have a long, long time ago.
Sure.
But that's probably where that comes from. That and liking the chafe between it's a way for me to sort of make the work feel quasi-figurative or not totally abstract, or in some instances as we move through the gallery you'll see things that are more overtly figurative, kind of cartoony, but yeah. So I don't know if I answered the question or not. I mean, I think that you bring your background with you, and you spend a lot of time as a young adult sort of drawing certain things, in my case cartoon characters for a comic strip. The vibe of that, the sense of humor of that, the literal depiction of that will bubble up and resurface over and over again. And the older I get, the more I realize these things from my youth and my young adulthood keep recurring and surfacing and reiterating themselves, bubbling up to the surface and reiterating themselves in new and different ways all the time.
Sure, and I also see that connection to every once in a while you have like little text that is in the pieces. I've seen it over here. I've seen it.
There's even like
this piece here.
Yeah.
And I mean,
I even did a little math problem up at the top.
And then you also have like sort of writing that's not writing, you know, in that reference of Cy Twombly's Vernon. And tell me.
It's a good example of that.
Yeah. How you worked with Vernon Fisher at UNT, and obviously huge shadow on artists. Some artists can't get out from under that. Obviously, you have. But what strategies and things that you took from him? What do you think that you've sort of moved away and did your own thing? Because you already had kind of a voice before you walked in the door, which was good.
Yeah.
And not everybody has that advantage. So could you tell me a little bit about Vernon Fisher and what you got out of that?
Very great observation, Todd. All of that's what you said is like a wonderful deep dive. I appreciate your research. So yeah, I think that, well, first of all, I realized how little I knew when I got there. I thought I knew a lot because I'd had 10 years off in between undergraduate and graduate school and lived a few lives and had a bunch of jobs. But I realized once I got there, like, the intellectual rigor of his class was something that was really new to me in the context of contemporary art. And so just that as a notion, that as an idea, as a big general idea was something that I needed to grapple with. But I think that aesthetically, something I probably he cast a big shadow, no doubt. And he was always being talked about outside of class. And obviously for those who don't know, like we're watching, a lot of his paintings feel like a blackboard with all these little painted vignettes. So it's all these little, a friend of mine once said they're pregnant with ideas. He's proposing all these little pictures within a blackboard situation. And while my work feels a lot more spontaneous, gestural, physical, I still take the notion from him of like little reflective thoughts.
Sure.
Mine tend to be a little bit more about gestural abstraction in mind and scribbling in mind, but the unpacking of multiple ideas is something, and presenting those is something I probably clarified after working with him. He was actually, for me, I think I'll say this, and maybe it was because I got there, you know, I didn't come right out of undergraduate. I got there with a little bit of idea of where I wanted to go.
Which helps a lot.
It helped a lot. So in my instance, like, there wasn't, because I was a little further along in that regard, a little bit more mature in that regard, like there was, the chance of me coming out making something that looked like his was limited,
right,
you know?
Right.
And he was actually, to his credit, he was always really good about pushing people, and he wasn't, you know, interested in getting a bunch of people making derivative work of his own. He was pretty good at getting you to kind of unpack things critically within your own voice, you know. So but yeah, I definitely, the idea of proposing lots of different sort of suggestive, reflective thoughts within a singular composition is something that I really noticed with him, his work, and in my own way, maybe I've presented that even more. You know, in a weird way, to go back to that, if you just look at the white background of that painting, I'm kind of doing it formally too, just how you want to, if you want to talk about it like that. But he would talk about Twombly's touch and Twombly's hand from time to time, and this sort of idea of this touch of suggestion of something, which comes up in his work literally and even in just the way that his touch on the surface, you know, he would never really talk about that, but I mean, you become just more and more clear of these different things.
Well, I mean, the whole modernist approach is thinking about painting as a painting, and you've taken that and continued with that idea.
You know, one other thing in regard to him and his ideas, and if we can move around, if we can move over here, actually in the front, it's really good. But one other thing that he was really good at, this sort of postmodern theoretical notion of representing something that feels like photography or a movie or a film, but it's not. It's like a still. And so I went through a whole phase, and there's still an example here of things where you might see something that looks like a piece of masking tape here or here or up there. It's all just paint. Some things are collage, some things are fake. If we can go like, that was something I clarified clearly with him my first semester. You know, like over here, and we can come back if y'all want. Yeah. Like over here, you see things that look like, but they also look like masking tape, and even up here duct tape, but it's all just paint. And I went through a whole thing after being in his class, and I for the first couple of years out of school, where I would you would see something on the surface of my paint that looked like a piece of scrap paper taped down, but it was all paint, you know? And so it was all this reappropriation, this sort of postmodern notion that he would present to us in class. That's probably, from a formal standpoint, that might be the biggest thing I got from him.
Oh,
although he breaks it, we both have gone on to break that rule and actually literally collaged again into the surface of work. So.
And your collage tends to be, well, it's your own stuff. What's that?
I'm cannibalizing my own material.
Is there some sort of structure in there that you're interested in, like tearing something apart and putting it back together and seeing if it actually works? Something that failed and you put together? What is the idea behind that?
Great. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, you can look around, and I'm always collaging and reappropriating my own material. To be honest with you, when I first started doing that, part of it was ego. I don't want to use anyone else's stuff. I want to use my own stuff, which is really sort of stupid. But then I just liked the way it looked. I'm like, well, I'm going to keep doing this. I don't really want to go find a bunch of magazines or newspapers and have that sort of conversation. And that's the way other people were collaging.
Sure.
And I actually, another big shift too was I just started to think about it as mark making, as drawing, and not necessarily thinking about it, not baggage. You know, when you use another resource as a collage element from a newspaper or magazine, it brings its own story with it.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And I wasn't so much interested in that. I was interested in just the sort of the look of the material, and after I cut it up and used it as a mark. So I was thinking about it as like a drawing element, like I would a black marker or a loaded paintbrush.
Sure. So you've already created a mark. You're taking that, reappropriating it, and layering it up, depending on how it works, and then it becomes its own mark, almost like in a Photoshop where you take it in, put it in a layer, put it in another layer. It's technically something that's happening right now, but you're doing it in your own process.
You're remixing your own music.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I also felt like, and this is something I'm always interested in, I felt like if I worked with that strategy in mind, the work's going to only look a certain sort of specific way. It's almost like a limitation.
Yeah.
It's almost like I've imposed, I hate rules. Like, I have a hard time with authority. The paintings present that. I have a hard time with authority and being told what to do. But what I've realized creatively, sometimes if you do employ some sort of rules on yourself, you can get good results.
Okay.
And I've realized that there was something very specific about reappropriating with cutting up, collaging my own stuff. And I like the idea of cannibalizing my own thing, you know?
Yeah.
There's something really, it just sounds interesting when I say it to you out loud.
And it also is that repurposing of your own material it still was working. It just wasn't working where it was, and it's still a mark that is valid. It just needs to be somewhere else.
Right, and then the other thing, this is such an interesting point too, is that the other thing is sometimes I cut it up and I look at it as a color instead of as what I was trying to depict literally through drawing or painting.
Sure.
Or, once in a while I'll flip over a shred of canvas and use the other side, or, it's this weird niche little way of, it's something that's actually quite important that really I haven't talked about a lot, but it's this way of kind of turning my noun into a verb and my verb into a pronoun, my pronoun into an adjective, and they all still feel very much like me and don't get. Another thing too is the material is not loaded in the same way as if I was using newspapers or magazines or some other sort of source material.
But definitely,
and
they have
like
more voice through the whole piece rather than.
Well, El Sui, El Sui, the big bottle caps.
Yeah.
There's so many different discussions you can have with collecting all that detritus from wherever he gets it from, like a junkyard or wherever. And I'm not interested in that discussion. I admire and appreciate the discussion. But anyway, so I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah, I had an extra shot of espresso in my coffee, so and it's starting to become more and more apparent. It's kicking in.
Well, we should talk a little bit about color because that's a very important thing. You, over the years, were exploding color, and you pared it down with this grays, the blacks, and then somehow the color just explodes even more. It just really creates that feeling of that's popping out. Tell us what got you to that point.
If you grab the book from over there, I was making.
You want this one?
Yeah. So like the piece on if you flip the piece on the cover of the book, and it's an art history book called Texas Abstract, Modern, and Contemporary. But the piece on the cover of a book is a giant paper. I would call it assemblage, but we can talk more about that too. And then I think they might have bookmarked the page. But anyway, you might want to, if you can hold it up. I was doing these big paper pieces, and like the orange and white one that you're looking at there, the cover piece, as I was doing those, and that was like seven years ago, not as much those, but the next page, the orange and white one on the next page, that was when I kind of started thinking of the neutrality of paper, the white neutral tone of the paper, the white color of the paper, right? Yeah. And so I guess as I worked, as I thought about that, as I got a couple of criticisms from other artists about polychromatic, too much color, and most artists don't know how to use color.
Sure.
But all of these things sort of added up in my head, and I slowly, actually a lot of this comes from a long, ongoing discussion with Tudor LaTroy, another artist here in town who's a good friend. But as we would have these discussions, as we were walking through shows, I realized, as I'm in the studio, hey, you can get a lot more mileage out of these high key colors you like to use when you put them up against a neutral, and you're not really sacrificing a lot, because there was a phase where it felt like 5-10 different colors are all being splattered around, for me. And I kind of worked my way through it to realize, hey, I can use less color, but the work can still feel very colorful. And I've arrived at this place where, as you walk through this show, as colorful as things feel, there's a lot of times where half the painting is neutral. It's a black, white, or even a gray, or off gray. And you don't feel that though. That doesn't
exactly.
And that's another. That's something else that I kind of have kept in mind as I've matured as an artist. I want to go in and feel before I think, and I like it when people, they feel colorful, even if they may not look as colorful as they used to. They're still very colorful. Slice it and dice it, But that's been a thing. It's an obvious thing to say, but when you're in there doing it, you can still, if someone said to me, well, it can feel colorful even if you use less color, I'd be like, okay, whatever, but it was something I had to work through based on material,
Well, when I saw them the first time I was at your studio and I talked about seeing the work and seeing so much black and white, but this explosion of color, I instantly thought of pop art, how it uses that same strategy. It would have, you know, white pages, and you'd have this little object here that would pop out because it was color. And pop art does that, you know, ads back in the 50s and 60s did that, and you're using those same ideas and strategies that are like, you know, you could get more punchy colors if you just go back and go with blacks, whites, grays, and then put in those colors.
Yeah, I agree. You know, there's one other thing I want to say. Again, all these people out there on Instagram looking at things on their phone, I can't stress how important it is, even during a pandemic, to get out and actually look at work. And I'll tell you something, I really love this particular painting. There's a sophistication to the gray and the way it works with the pink and the tangerine, or the peachy color, whatever you want to call it. But I got this out of looking at a gray, out of a Francis Bacon painting that was up during a long-term show here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. I went back and looked at that show several times.
Thank you for taking.
Yeah, you when you were in town. Yeah. But like in the last room, there was this really beautiful gray painting with a peachy colored figure in the ground, and there was something that resonated with me with those color combinations, and it caught me. And then I kept thinking about it because it's like that's the last thing people really talk about regarding his work is just the pigment. You know, they're very high key pigments sometimes. You're not going to get preoccupied talking about the figure and the tragedy and the stringing coat. But there's something about, I took a picture with my phone of that image when the guard wasn't looking, and it dictated the color palette of this. I went with like a darker greener gray, but I got the color palette from getting out and looking. Anyway, I wanted to get that out before I forgot, because too many people never get out and look, and they don't make the effort to get out and look. And I interact with a lot of these people on social media all the time, and they never go look. You gotta go look in person. Don't come look in person.
Yeah. I mean, the only reason to be an artist is go out and see stuff. I mean, I ended up falling into writing because I was seeing so many shows. People are like, you should write.
Yeah.
You know? So it spawns other things that you don't even expect yourself to do.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about Francis Bacon, I mean, you can't help but not think about this fleshiness.
The fleshing, yeah. I mean, certainly. This doesn't look like a bacon, but I've looked at his work for a long, long time, and there's things about his work that I like, there's things I don't like, but there was something about that particular palette, and it caught me in the right moment, and then I just sort of ran with it because I love the idea of like thinking about color with his work, because it's not what people generally tend to talk about.
Yeah, and it was a big factor in several of the pieces of that.
Right.
It just didn't even, it kind of hit you. Yeah.
Kind of hit you, yeah.
Even more so than the figures.
Yeah, I would agree. I would never have gotten that if I would have been looking at it on my phone or on a computer.
Exactly.
I had to
see that.
But it ended up dictating the choices of the headlining piece of the show. You know. So anyway.
We're gonna move over to the other one?
Sure, whatever you want. Whatever you want.
Well, you have on this one here, it's a little unusual. It's like a conceal and reveal. I mean,
right.
Concealing a lot of it, but you could tell that it was all done before, so it's clear that you're doing a different approach on that.
And when that happened, I'm like, oh my God, I might have a whole new move here that I can do a whole bunch.
Sure.
And I tried it again, and it didn't work quite right, and I got mad. And this is actually, this is one of the last things I did for the show. And what's interesting is I've been working towards this for quite some time. I mean, but like I kind of picked up speed as we got closer to turning the show in, and I knew when Sarah had booked her time at my studio several weeks ahead of time, so I had a deadline for several weeks. Like, there were a lot of the work in the show is stuff that I sort of sped up, especially the small ones. Like I sped up and finished towards the end, but like, this has a bit of that conceal and reveal, which is a really astute observation that was really exciting for me. The other thing was I've been having discussions with Tudor as well over the years about, you know, don't be afraid of the edge, don't be self-conscious about the edge of the composition. And so that argument, I shouldn't say argument, that discussion, a heated discussion, passionate discussion, was on my mind. And in this particular painting, I literally wanted to self-consciously, overtly get you to pay attention to the,
Sure.
to the edge. And then all these artists now are presenting their work in those modernist frames in galleries in New York and stuff, this hipster work, and you know. And so I was just like, well, fuck it, I'm gonna. Sorry, that slipped on Instagram. I think my mom's watching. But I wanted to be overt and blatant with a particular painting about that idea of the edge and subconscious.
You know, like
framing.
Mondrian does it with that little, every once in a while, just leave a little key there, right at the edge. He doesn't quite finish the squares, and you're like, it's just a little off balance. You don't expect it, and so that's the same way. It's like it's kind of playing with that edge.
Right.
I mean, you go over the edge on this one.
Right. Yeah.
So,
And this is a reader. This one's a. I love the color in this one. And what's nice about being here near the window with the natural light is from far away the upper half might feel like black or really dark, but then there's a lot of iridescence and a lot of colors mixed in. You start to see this sort of dark brown and the iridescent green. I love the color relationships in this painting, but I normally wouldn't do this, but it just seems so. It felt so right in this particular piece, you know.
and you've broken the rectangle before. It's not like
right.
it's that
I'm interested
you're scared
in.
of.
Yeah, I mean something you were had alluded to. Things generally feel rectilinear. I usually have good results when the work feels sort of rectilinear and
Is it
vertically
like a
oriented.
portrait thing?
It's a portrait thing. It probably stems from I make these sort of size paintings. I've always made paintings that are 70 inches by 60 inches or 80 inches tall by 70 inches. And there's a little bit of I like to be able to physically fight with something that's about my size.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I can just sort of scale up and scale down from that. But for a long, long time, it was like lots of paintings of this size. And I like the idea that I'm fighting with them a little bit. Or it's
Sure.
about my size when I go like this.
And it's kind of that rule that you put on yourself a little bit, which.
Something else over the years is that I would notice a lot of artists can't scale. They can't scale up very well. It's a composition thing, you know. And I took a lot of pride in being able to make large-scale things that were formally worked, you know.
And formalism is something that you're really interested in. You really want to make sure that work is resolved.
Right. It's not a cool thing to say, but I'm willing to admit it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of artists that they just put anything out there and they think it's gold, and they're not really thinking about formal qualities. I think that's a long-term weakness on their pieces. I don't know if that's going to. That's a good thing to talk about. There is sort of how is the work going to continue to speak to next generations of people? What do you see going on with that?
Well, I'll say along the lines of that point, you know, the things that you tend to remember over the course of history from artists that are long gone, they generally are, for the most part, they're formally resolved.
Sure.
There are exceptions to that where it's almost like they were the scientist who's in the lab who discovered the thing, and now you've got this historical documentation or souvenir of this thing that's not formally resolved. That's a big part of art history.
It tends to almost be like an artifact rather than artwork.
Correct.
Which is not exactly your goal. You want to make this into art. You're not interested in creating a bunch of artifacts for people to sort of parcel out and write.
I don't need to be here. Put the camera on him. He knows better than me. I love everything you're saying, man. Absolutely. Yeah, I want them to. You know, you can't fault them for not formally working. Just fundamental drawing, undergraduate drawing, one composition or form or whatever.
But I mean,
a lot of artists, they hoo-ha. They're like, it feels like a tire and fuddy-duddy argument to them. But the truth of the matter is that instinctively, intuitively, emotionally,
sure.
You know.
And I think the emotional part is where we connect to it far more when it's something that we have even a touch of familiarity, and formalism could give that to us.
Right. You got to know the rules before you can break them.
Sure.
You got to let us know that you know them and you're breaking them in just a certain sort of way too.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, totally. It's important to me. I want them to work. You know, with color, composition, form. There's something I don't talk about a lot, but it's actually a really interesting thing. It just doesn't come up with. there's sort of a cadence to shape and mark, and I'm very interested in that kind of cadence. It's not that different than, I'm not a musician, but it's not that different than song structure, right? Verse, lyric, verse, the mix of ingredients between percussive instruments and acoustic instruments and electric instruments. Same sort of thing.
But this is not like 5 minutes of silence.
No. I'm not the 5 minutes of silence guy, you know.
You want to take a look at the papers?
I mean, maybe one day if things, you know,
Yeah.
get a lot of money in the bank, settle down, have a mortgage, maybe I'll be the silence guy. But not now. Not now.
Yeah.
You want to talk about this one?
Yeah.
Y'all let us know about the clock.
This inspired me to even think about Snobble when we were talking about that layering up. You know, he does the plates, but yours is paper, of course. And then you're moving to canvas, which is a little heavier, but not really. You know? So it's you feel that sense of that form of collaging or that assemblage of building up a surface and then allowing it to have different marks because you've layered over those marks. And when I thought of him, I started writing about that, and it even related more in the fact that because we were talking about his work and how he would just sort of put things out there, swing out there, and drop some pieces, whereas you're more willing to sort of tear it up if it's not working and get it back into another structure.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why this piece in particular inspired me at first to think about him, but then it took me way further, but still.
You know, those plate paintings are something I looked at in graduate school. That's some of the most, I think, some of his more interesting stuff, and clearly historically relevant. But there's a couple of things I want to touch on, because you had mentioned something before the filming about assemblage. I kind of use the term assemblage loosely.
Sure.
Maybe I'm not really making quote-unquote assemblage. You think of heavier, weightier materials and juxtaposing all kinds of random things. When you think historically of the use of the term assemblage in art, I would think.
Oh, definitely.
And I'm not doing that, but
not Roscoe, but
Rauschenberg. Yeah, combines and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think because the work was so largely scaled and it sounded kind of sexy to say assemblage.
It does.
Someone had called it assemblage. I'm like, okay, I'll go with assemblage. But I am the action, the verb of the work is collage. You know, and drawing, mark making. I generally need to work with materials that this show in a way is a bit of a pivotal, important thing because of what I'm about to say. I'm jumped ahead of myself, sorry. But
That's okay.
I have historically, for years and years, needed to work with lightweight materials like paper and canvas that I can cut and tear and shred quickly and work with easily. When material would start to feel weighted or heavy, like a plate stuck to the surface of a giant piece of wood that is turned into a painting, I would lose interest. And I think it's because I'm impulsive and impatient in a certain way with the way I make things.
Sure.
And so anything that wasn't lightweight or easy to maneuver would start to make me a little crazy. And what happened was I just dug deeper and deeper and deeper into my 2 or 3 materials, which were, you know, paper and canvas and paint, right? And markers. So paint markers. So that's sort of where that would come from. And I would get good results. And I like the idea of people being able to recognize this fundamental, unusual, maybe not that unusual, but this use of paper or canvas as a sculptural material or crumpled up but still really working effectively. It's not necessarily a new idea, but I hope I didn't go too far off on a tangent, but I hope I'm resolving what you were alluding to with things like this, you know.
Yeah, and that show we saw in Dallas, that a lot of those works were a whole bunch of canvas that was put together. It was
yeah.
really
I mean, we've got
connected.
Something similar to that. If you wanted, it's up to you.
We
if
go
you
back
want to
over
double.
there and take a look.
If that's something you wanted to talk about. Guns on the Table, Cash in the Drawer. And this sort of alludes to things that we've been talking about, you know. thinking of the neutrality of the material, thinking about it as color and not just as a material. But yet the material is overtly there, you know. And so this sort of stuff was born out of the work we were talking about with the art history book, you know, where things get sculptural and tactile, but it's not my main interest. But I like reappropriating materials and using them in unexpected ways. That's probably the short answer, you know. And so I'm thinking, but to be more specific, I really love the beige tone of the raw material. Right? And I like using it as a color like you would white paint or gray paint or whatever. And also people don't do that a lot.
No.
You know. It happens with the blacks too. I mean, you know.
Oh, definitely.
I'm giving away all my secrets.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually more important than I don't really talk about that very often. It just doesn't come up, but it's actually important. And I think it might be a little, I'm thinking out loud here when I say this, but I think it might be one of those things that's easy to say and harder to do. You know, here's more fake, that's paint.
More fake tape, yeah. Well, you know, the raw canvas dates back to, you know, the Impressionists. They're leaving those raw canvas, and they were shocked by that whole feeling. That's an unfinished painting. Don't show that.
Yeah.
And you're continuing that tradition of, and you're actually folding it back on itself, and even showing it to where it used to hang. It's like, it's really, it was used.
Yeah, and here's when your reflective dictation of the underdrawing, and I forgot I even wrote that there. Yeah, disenchanted youth grazing in the streets. These are potential there's another working titles or thoughts. Why not now? You know, what the hell am I? Yeah.
I don't know.
I read a lot, and I'm listening to a lot of podcasts. I'm reading, and I read a lot. So it's just, I'm always scribbling down text from days of writing jokes, right? You know,
Sure.
so
You've got to continue to be like sharp.
Right.
And you see that in the titles. The titles are loaded up. I should read some titles. I mean, these are quite interesting. We got Over Here, Written in Heat, published at once. I wish I could do that. I can't do that.
Some of these are things I lift out of books and articles and song lyrics and stuff. You know, I don't make them all up. You know, sometimes it sounds good. I read it and I used it.
Oh, I mean that they're as punchy as the colors. They really are. The cloud evaporated, and then you were gone. Right here, and you've got this very aggressive character biting us down, almost like a dragon. It's like really interesting.
I get a lot of mileage out of triangles.
Yeah, what's with you have several of these pieces. Is that like an aggressive mark? Or?
Yeah, I looked it up, and the triangle. I made a social media post about this. Triangle is vehemence. I had, and where it came from is I had a non-artist friend many years ago. He came to one of my pieces, and it had all these jagged edge triangles that might have alluded to teeth. And he had a visceral reaction, like, I feel like I'm getting stabbed. I'm like, oh, great! I don't want to stab my buddy. Hey, Brad, if you're watching, I wasn't out to stab him, but he walked up and he just said, God, all those sharp edges, I feel like I'm being stabbed. Like, great. You're like, I mean, you just saw the look on his face. And I always remembered that. It's so weird the way that kind of thing happened. And I just reiterated the triangle as a formal device. You know, the circle's too yin-yang, the circle's just too...
Sure. Soft.
There's so many different Eastern and Western cultural differences, philosophical implications with the circle. But I like the edge of the triangle. And in this particular case, I'm again going to give away a lot. Like the fact that it's blue, I thought about the baby blue, I thought about the sky. That's where I got the cloud notion and went with that, you know, that title. But I also like the way that, like, there's a play sometimes between flat, opaque shapes and how they cut into more mixed colors and sometimes a little bit more messy gestural stuff. There's an example towards the back of that too, if we want to walk back there. And I don't know how much more time we've got, but we should sort of mention the small things too. We've got time, but like I'm doing the same thing here, you know, where playing with stains and shifts in opacity and transparency versus things that feel a little more opaque and overt. You know, the other thing too that's important for me is, you know, there's a lot of nods in the work to geometric abstraction as well, even though a lot of people see things that feel like abstract expressionism or neo-expressionism. There's a lot of references to that, and I like the idea at times of presenting different ways to make things.
Right, and breaking it up, and this is not the only way to think of.
Yeah, I mean, there's a thoughtful, slow process to making a hard edge shape versus spilling a stain.
Sure.
The stain's got to look right once it's dry, but you know, these are two. I would imagine you're using different parts of your brain too.
And the paint on this particular one layered up almost like your collage. You're going from one to the other, on top of the other, with a drawing on it. You know, it stacks. You can feel that stack.
Yeah.
And so, you know, even the flatter pieces are still stacked.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Do you want to?
Let's look at the small one.
Small one, maybe we'll end on that. Does that sound good? We'll sort of. So, this has sort of been, if you want to grab yours, yeah. This has sort of been a bit of the breakthrough with these small ones. I would normally do these on paper at this size, 12 inches tall and 9 inches wide. These are all on sheets of canvas. And then in some cases, they're small paintings that are mounted on board, on wooden panel. And again, we were talking about me needing to work with paper and canvas and the fluidity and the accessibility of those lightweight materials. But I kind of came to a place while I was making work for the show where I guess there was a little less pressure on me in the world and the world that I live in. And I just kind of came to a place where, well, why not introduce a new material? And then when I drilled into it, it sort of started to make, as simple as it is, you know, but it started to make sense to me in the way that tearing and cutting other materials seemed to make sense to me. I don't know if I'm going to keep doing it or not, but it was nice for something stiff to feel right. And I really like the way these little ones turned out, you know. Yeah, so that's that. You know, sheets of canvas and mounting things on board and painting on board have been kind of a big new move for me, you know.
Now these feel really a lot more like portraits. Are you thinking of individuals in these pieces? Are you sort of universalizing these are people?
Do you want to sit?
Yeah. Are people that you know, or people that you, or are they just kind of people you've seen on the street? Or?
It's a great question. I to be honest with you, I'm using it as a foundational building block. I don't really have a particular individual in mind. I hate to say it, it's a bit of a formal device to talk about the other. So all of these are just the other. What I mean by that is that they are all you, me, anyone.
Sure.
You know? And I kind of leave it at that. I like the variation in shape and scale, and it's giving me a chance to play with material and color. And that's really, I've never talked about that, but that's the truth. I hate that, you know, I hope I don't hurt anyone's feelings because they thought they saw their Aunt Shirley over there and their cousin Fred over there, but it's sort of a building block device that lets me play with material, color, form, and the small ones in a very distilled way, you know.
Yeah. They speak to you. They're actually a little bit more jokey. You feel a little bit that they're kind of winking at you a bit, which is nice. It's they have a little bit. The big pieces are really punchy. The small pieces, they just speak to you on a completely different level, which is interesting because the last show I saw you, there was almost a dialogue. They almost felt like two of a family, but these guys play a little bit in their own little game, which is, you know, sometimes scale does that. It changes the script a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, they're usually succeeding or failing pretty quickly. And,
sure.
And I think because it's such a small scale, and they're distilled. There are fewer ingredients in the recipe of the small ones than the larger ones, and so I know whether they're working or not pretty quickly. Although sometimes some of them, as simple as they look, do take longer, and other times they come together like so quickly. You just never know. Every day is like riding the lightning, which is how I want it. And generally, the larger pieces tend to take longer. I mean, the one last thing I would say, if we want to sort of close up shop, is this particular scale of these three and the one right there by the windows is a scale that I haven't been able to work at or I haven't even considered working at up until recently, since like 2012 or something, you know. And I think this is an interesting piece to talk about because of just the different plays and surface and you know, much like I drilled a hole into that small one there, you're cutting back into this. I do that sometimes too.
But I wanted to, before you take them off, is you should talk about sort of how you've, especially on these works, but even on those, you're talking about you took a little bit of time, you thought about it, you sat down, you jumped on, did some activity. I thought that your process was interesting in that fact that you have this sort of random amount of energy, this great amount of energy, and then you stop. And you don't finish a piece immediately. There's just like other things that you make choices with. So it's clear that there's like, it's a thinking game, action game, thinking game,
back and forth. Yeah.
Constantly, that feeling of trying to get it right where it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fluidity and confidence and even bravado in the physical execution, but that's married with hours of sitting and staring and analytical thought. And a lot of people don't work that way. A lot of people plan everything out and they go in and they execute. I'm all vibe, man.
Yeah. But you know, that's interesting. A lot of people see a work like this, they're going to think, well, they put it out right instantly, it's done, and that's just not the case at all.
That's not the case. It's so much thought and work, years and years of work. I mean, I've dumped my whole life into what I'm doing at the moment.
How long was it you paid this painting?
My whole life.
40 years, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much the truth. The trick is to make them look like the trick is to make them look effortless and spontaneous.
Exactly.
But it's like an athlete. It's like a graceful athlete, Olympic level athlete. You know, they make it look easy, but there's so many. Was it 10,000 hours? Malcolm Gladwell, is it Tipping Point? 10,000 hours book. I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Putting in the time, and not just the mark making, but it's the thinking, it's the reading, it's the going to shows, it's just all that.
It's all happening between your ears.
Yeah, it's
or
sure
almost
is.
all.
Almost all of it. Barely any of it's actually the making.
Absolutely. So, well, I mean, if you're good to wrap it up, I am. Does that sound good? Thank you, Instagram.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone here at the gallery, Alexis Page and Sarah Foltz. Y'all are the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard Sherman.
Thank you, Todd. Todd Camplin in the house. Yeah,
Awesome.
save it. Oh.